Okay, so the make sure I'm on. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, sorry. Okay, the final phase of the Cold War under containment is going to lead to the Vietnam War. So the full-scale American involvement in Vietnam began in 1965 in a series of steps designed primarily to prevent a North Vietnamese victory. With the political situation in Saigon growing more hopeless every day, Johnson advisors urged the bombing of the North as the only conceivable solution. American air attacks would serve several purposes. They would block North Vietnamese infiltration routes, make Hanoi pay a heavy price for its role, and lift sagging morale of South Vietnamese. At least this was the hope of the bombings. The airstrikes aimed at impeding the communist supply and demanding Hanoi's economy proven ineffective. Johnson then authorized the use of American ground forces in South Vietnam, but he restricted them to defensive operations instead to protect American air bases. What happens thereafter gets a little bit unsettling. In retaliation to this escalation of bombings and this escalation of ground forces, American ground forces, there were a series of attacks out in the Gulf of Tonkin, which later proved to be problematic as far as the reporting was concerned. So there were two attacks out in the Gulf of Tonkin, one of which happened, but even though it was in international waters, there was a case that the North Vietnamese were justified in their attacks as far as trying to protect their sovereignty as laid out in the Geneva Accords of 1955. The other attack never happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, there's more details in the link that's provided that you need to take a look at in the lecture document titled, the Gulf of Tonkin. So make sure you take a look at that. But this kind of auspicious event that happened in the Gulf of Tonkin was utilized in Congress to basically give Johnson a blank check in Vietnam, and a lot of congressmen and senators later regretted this. If they would later claim that if they had known more about what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, they would not have given Johnson that much authorization. Who knows how true that is, but it does bring up a lot of parallels about what happened in Vietnam and what happened later under the Bush administration with Iraq. What begins to happen is in July of 1965, Johnson would permit a gradual increase in the bombing of North Vietnam and allowed American ground commanders to conduct combat operations in the South. These decisions formed an open-ended commitment to employ American military forces as the situation demanded. Convinced that withdrawal would destroy American credibility before the world, and that an invasion of the North would lead to World War III, Johnson opted for large-scale but limited military intervention. Moreover, Johnson feared the domestic consequences of either extreme. A pullout could cause a massive political backlash at home, as conservatives condemned him for betraying the South Vietnamese to communism. An all-out war, however, would mean the end of social programs. He feared once Congress focused on the conflict. As he put it, that bitch of a war would destroy the woman I really love, the Great Society. So the Great Society, it was basically his promise to the American people. This is pretty amazing if you think about it. An American president is promising through social programs to end poverty, right? And he wins by a landslide in 1964 on that promise of the so-called Great Society, which is basically a promise to complete the New Deal. right? End poverty. And American people believe this at this time, right? Not because they're gullible, but they believe America can do this. But what ends up happening is, as the war continues and escalates, the costs become too much, and the Great Society will demise. And when you view the speech of Dr. King's speech, he talks about this, right? The Great Poverty Programs become eviscerated by the insane, as he puts it, basically the insane determination to fight the war in Vietnam. So look for that. That's one of the reasons why he decides to come out publicly against the war. Dr. King, that is. So Johnson settled for a limited war, relative. It was a pretty large war, though, on the ground, committing 500,000 American troops to battle in Southeast Asia, all the while pretending it was a minor engagement and refusing to ask the American people for the support and sacrifice required for victory. By 1968, what Lyndon Johnson had once referred to as a raggedy-ass little fourth-rate country had brought the world's most powerful military to its knees. Just an amazing turn of events, if you really think about it. As the Korean conflict, the American people were learning that fighting communism was a complicated task, to say the least. Thus, by 1968, the American people had decided that they had enough of Vietnam and the containment policy. And this is where, by 1968, this is where you see these large protests begin to happen, and a complete split within American culture when it comes to foreign policy. That's very much still with us today. And an end to what FDR would have said, never again, that kind of mentality where we would do whatever it took to make sure that things didn't get out of control. It's going to become more complicated and more nuanced from then on, from 1968 on. With Richard Nixon, the Cold War in Vietnam would come to an end, but a very slow end. Nixon had a three-part plan to end the conflict. One, renewed bombing and a hard line in negotiations with Hanoi, and a gradual withdrawal of American troops. The last tactic, known as Vietnamization, proved to be relatively the most successful, somewhat. The plan involved training the troops of South Vietnam to take over the American combat role. The number of American soldiers in Vietnam dropped from 543,000 in 1968 to 30,000 by 1972, resulting in a domestic opposition to the war dropping sharply. Thus, the latter part of Phase 4, Vietnam, becomes the so-called Nixon Doctrine, which proclaimed that the United States could no longer do it all. That is, provide all the plans, programs, decisions, and defense of the free world. The doctrine claimed that in the future, Asians and others would have to fight their own wars without the support of large bodies of American ground troops. Right? Again, this is Nixon Doctrine. Obviously, this is going to change once we get to the so-called Bush Doctrine. The Nixon Doctrine was an attempt to bring American policy into line with capabilities and to draw back definitions of interest to correspond with what Americans could afford to do and could hope to accomplish. A necessary coercive, a corrective after a generation of Cold War in which American activities constantly expanded, in which Americans shouldered burden after burden, only to learn in the later 60s that it had overreached its resources. Détente with the Soviet Union and rapprochement with China seem signs of this new doctrine as well. Nixon concluded that the road out of Vietnam ran through Beijing and Moscow. The two great communist powers were clashing bitterly over their rival interpretations of Marxism. Nixon astutely perceived that these Chinese-Russian tensions afforded the United States an opportunity to play off one antagonist against the other and to enlist aid to both in pressuring North Vietnam into peace. Nixon, hitherto an uncompromising anti-communist, announced that he would travel to both China and Russia, the Soviet Union. In February 1972, he traveled to China and paved a way for improved relations between the two countries. Nixon next traveled to Moscow in May of 1972 to play his China card in a game of high-stakes diplomacy. The Soviet Union, hungry for American foodstuffs and haunted by the fear of intensified rivalry with an American-backed China, were ready to deal. Nixon's visit ushered in an end to the beginning of the end of the Cold War era and a relaxed tensions called detente, and resulted in several significant agreements. One product of eased relations was a grand deal of 1972, a 3-year arrangement to sell the Soviets at least $750 million worth of wheat, corn, and other cereals. Far more important were efforts to stem the dangerously competitive coexistence practice of the nuclear arms race. The first major achievement was the anti-ballistic missiles, the ABM Treaty, which limited each nation to 2 clusters of defensive missiles. The second pact was an agreement known as SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, to freeze the number of long-range nuclear missiles for 5 years. Nixon's detente diplomacy was, on the whole, successful. By checkmating and co-opting the 2 great communist powers, the president had cleverly set the stage for America's exit from Vietnam and its leading role within the Cold War, and setting the stage for what would happen in the 80s as the Cold War under Reagan and later Bush the first would definitely come to an end. In some, perhaps the Nixon Doctrine was not a new diplomacy, or at least not to the extent its supporters claimed. Some of the assumptions of the Cold War were passing from American policy by 1969, such as its belief in American having unlimited or universal power, and vague ideas about what constituted a threat to American national interests. Nixon's policies with the Soviet Union and rapprochement with China seemed signs of a new policy, but there were other signs that the Nixon Doctrine may have been no more than a reasonable attempt to bring American policy in line with capabilities, to draw back definitions of interest to correspond with what America could afford to do, both economically and politically, and could hope to accomplish. The Nixon Doctrine was necessary, a corrective after a generation of the Cold War in which American political and military involvement had expanded all over the world, in which Americans should shoulder burden after burden, only to learn in retrospect that it had overreached its resources. So the climate, and this would later lead to, and we're not going to get into this, but this would later lead to the Reagan administration's final phase of the Cold War, which would end it from 1981 to 1989, as the Soviet Union begins to dissolve as not only a superpower, but as an actual empire. Basically, in summary, the end of World War II brought a dramatic final shift in American foreign policy as the United States broke its isolationist tradition and sought a permanent role in American affairs. The predominant characteristic of this new policy was the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Containment originally emerged in response to the Soviet pressure on Eastern Europe, but that doctrine was expanded by succeeding administrations to include resistance to communism wherever it appeared. A Cold War mentality shaped the United States foreign policy throughout the post-Cold War World War II era. As a result, you had Vietnam, you had before that Korea, were two of the outgrowths of the Cold War mentality or containment doctrine. And at the same time, the United States asserted its economic and political supremacy. It established a pattern of a double standard in these areas in dealing with the Soviet Union. While it was okay for the United States to establish missiles within a few miles of the Soviet border in Turkey, Kennedy was prepared to fight a nuclear war to compel the Soviets to remove their missiles from Cuba, 90 miles south of Florida, which was almost caused an end to civilization and perhaps humanity itself. American, and I'll let you read more about that in the hippocampus. But anyway, Cold War, a very tense time. Luckily, we got out of it relatively unscathed as far as our country was concerned. Not so much for other countries around the world. Anyway, that will conclude the lecture on the Cold War, and this will be the last lecture of the semester. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Talk to you guys later.